Welcome to the Bible class of Jews for Jesus with Bob Mendelsohn.
Tonight we're studying 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Paul has started talking about liberty and limits in last week's lesson. And he was talking about things that he could do, and anybody could do, but for the sake of others, you limit yourself. For the sake of love, you don't go exercise all your freedoms. Now he's going to put that in terms of his own apostleship and validate what he's teaching by means of what he has personally done on behalf of the Corinthians. The Corinthians were begun by him. Of course, there were Corinthians. What I'm saying is the community of faith in Corinth was started by the Apostle Paul. Sosthenes, who's writing this letter with him, was one of the first believers in the community of faith, a leader in the synagogue. Paul is writing to the believers here saying, look, you have no rights unless I came along and gave them to you because I led you to Messiah. You're my fruit. You're the seal, verse 2, he says, of my apostleship in the Lord. So when he's going to teach them about limiting themselves or guarding themselves from being libertarian, doing whatever they want because they can, he says, you still have to check yourself. And he's going to use himself as an image, and he's going to use the athlete and the ox. He's going to use all kinds of things to help them understand that real love involves self-discipline. Real love is not about licentiousness, which is living as if there is no license, as if everything is freewheeling like we did in the 60s, but that a thing is able to move if it has boundaries. And the way we have boundaries is self-limiting, a very healthy way to live personally and corporately. So that's what he's doing. All right, let's go back to verse 1. Am I not free? Can't I do these things that I've just been warning you guys about? This is about food and eating things. Remember last week, sacrifice to idols. That was what we were talking about. Hey, I'm an apostle. I can do anything I want, basically, he's saying. I have more rights than you, but listen to what he does. I check myself. I'm not, verse 15, using any of these things. I've used none of these things. And I'm writing these so that it'll be done. It might be better if I had nothing going, because though I'm free, verse 19, from all men, I've made myself a slave to all. So that's his thesis, if you will. Let's look more particularly back at verse 1. Have I not seen Yeshua, our Lord? Does that bother you? Had he seen Yeshua, our Lord? He's writing in 52, 57 CE. Yeshua is dead at 30. Never had a conversation with him in the flesh, but he says, I've seen him. And so he's referencing Acts chapter 9, what we call conversion of the Apostle Paul, when he's Rabbi Saul and he sees a bright light. There's no mention of a horse or that he falls off, but everybody makes him fall off his horse. Who are you, Lord? I'm Jesus, whom you're persecuting. He said, send him out into the world. First go learn and then go out. So that's what the apostle is saying in verse 1. Haven't I seen Yeshua? I've been personally connected with the Messiah, and I've got rights. Aren't you my work, he says, in the Lord? In other words, aren't you the product of what I've been doing? To others I might not be, but at least I am to you an apostle. Apostle is a messenger. Apostle is a Greek word. Apostello, sent forth. So, shaliach, you know what a shaliach is in modern day Hebrew? A messenger who actually represents somebody, an ambassador. The Israeli tourism department sends shalichim out. The cantor or whoever's leading the prayers at the synagogue is the shaliach tzibur, a representative. That's what he's saying. That's who I am, an apostle, one sent forth by Yeshua. At least I am to you. And you're the seal of my apostleship. Some people may say you're not really a very good apostle, he says, but at least the Corinthians look pretty good. They're my folks. So here's my defense. I've got 3 different rights, but I'm not going to use any of them. Number 1, verse 4, I've got a right to eat and drink off the gospel. I've got a right to be provided for because I'm an apostle. Number 2, I've got a right to take a believing wife along. So my family should be provided for as well. And number 3, in chapter 7, he looks like he's a widow because he's saying, I wish you could all be like me, single. And yet, there's no way a guy who studies under Gamaliel, who's part of the power brokers of Jerusalem in those days, would not be married. 30 years old, a rabbi, he's married. But it sounds like he's a widower, which is exactly what he would argue, stay single at that point. So verse 5, don't I have a right to take a believing wife, family, my kids? Everybody should be provided for by you, Corinthians.
But he's choosing not to.
That's undergirding him is, I'm not going to use those, but I've got every right to if I want wanted. And third is, verse 6, or do only Barnabas and I not have a right to refrain from working? So there's other apostles who are well known, other religious leaders of the day, who don't do any other work, but whose work is praying and teaching the Bible. We learn that in Acts chapter 6, that the leaders in Jerusalem said that they would give themselves, devote themselves, they said, to prayer and the Word. So he's saying, hey, I've got a right to be provided for. I've got a right to take my family and that they'll be provided for. And third, I've got a right to not have to provide for myself in secular work. You guys all know how scandalous religious leaders are who are seen as wealthy and skimming everything off the top, and their religion is just about money. And you probably hear that from teenagers and others at school and in your work. Religion, it's just a money game. It's all about the money. Haven't you heard that? I don't think religion's all about money. I think religion ought to include money. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. How else should the Apostle Paul have eaten? Why does he have to go take another job, work at the convenience store, and then on Tuesday teach the Bible class? Can't he be full-time in the work? So he's saying, I've got the right to do that, and others. Now he uses the secular world, using soldiers and farmers. He says, who at any time serves as a soldier at his own expense? You know, a military guy doesn't go out and then work at the 7-Eleven. But in Afghanistan, he's working I got to change clothes, I got to put on my 7-Eleven uniform. I mean, he's being sent by the Australian government. There he is, and he's taken care of. So he's saying, God sent me out as a soldier, and I should be provided. Who plants a vineyard and doesn't eat the fruit of it? It's like a no-brainer, right? And who tends a flock and doesn't use the milk of the flock? So he's basically arguing that if this really is my field, I should really do it. And then he uses an older Testament reference from Deuteronomy chapter 25, which in the middle of Deuteronomy 25 is kind of just dropped in. Take a look at it, would you? Deuteronomy 25, verse 4. If there's a dispute, verse 1, between men and they go to court and the judges decide their case, and they justify the righteous and condemn the wicked, then it shall be, if the wicked man deserves to be beaten, the judge shall then make him lie down and be beaten in the presence with the number of stripes according to his guilt. 10 stripes, 20 stripes, whatever. No more than 40 times, though. How many times could a Jew be beaten?
39.
You're right. It says 40, but a Jew can only be beaten 39 times by a Jew. Why is that? The hedge principle. It's a classic Jewish way of interpreting the Bible, just in case. Jewish men have the peyot. Some have a full beard. Some have a goatee like me. Some, because the Bible says don't cut the corners of your beard. Where are the corners? None of us is rectangular. There are 5 places that the rabbis define as corners, but where are those? So the rabbis say don't cut the corners. What are the corners? So just in case, you let the whole thing grow. Others say, no, these are the corners. These are the corners. Buffers, hedges. It's a key. What time are you supposed to get up in the morning? Most men wake up just a few minutes before they need to be out the door. Most women take a good hour and a half. But everybody gives themselves a certain measure of a buffer, a certain time. I went to go visit somebody and I said, in fact, I called it spare tire time. I need to be there by 10 because, well, I'll call it spare tire time. Really, I'm supposed to be there at 10:30, but it's a hedge. It's a safety net. So this says 40 times, but no more. So the rabbis say 39 times and no more. Because you might miscount once. You probably won't miscount twice. So just in case, 39 will do the thing. It's a buffer. It's a hedge. So that he doesn't beat them any more stripes, and then your brother is not degraded. Verse 4, you shall not muzzle the ox while he's threshing. Verse 5, when brothers live together and one of them dies. What? I mean, in the middle of a justice section and a dealing with brothers and levirate law, he sticks in this thing about oxen. So it's right when the apostle says in 1 Corinthians 9, God is not concerned about oxen, is he? He's saying, in context, this is all about people dealing with other people. And that's how we should understand it.
Firstly, what does it mean to do not muzzle the ox?
Well, he's threshing so that he can eat. It's all about the ox who's pulling the plow. He's doing gardening. Okay, he's working the field. He's creating all those lanes for the seeds and for whatever. But he's threshing, which means he's harvesting. So there's a sickle behind him. But he shouldn't just be out working. Don't muzzle. Don't prevent the animal from eating the very thing that he's producing for you.
That's compassionate.
It is. It's a regard for all beings, and that's God. But he's saying, in context, this isn't about oxen. So it is. He's not deriding oxen. He's saying it's bigger than that. So we're back to 1 Corinthians 9 and verse number 8. Doesn't Torah also say these things? It's written in Torah, you shall not muzzle the ox while he's threshing. God is not concerned about oxen, is he? Well, in a way, yes, obviously, in point, he's talking about a bigger concern that God has for you and for people, which is loving. So he's using that to say, I'm out working in the field of God. I ought to be able to, don't muzzle me while I'm working. I'm a gardener and I should be able to eat from my own garden. And you're my garden. For our sake, verse 10, it's written, because the plowman ought to plow in hope and the thresher to thresh in hope of sharing the crops. I mean, why would a farmer go out and work if he's not going to eat from it? Makes no sense. If we sowed spiritual things in you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? Now, this is when people get all upset. You know, the Catholic Church is the richest church. You know, they have billions and gazillions. And, oh, of course, in the basement of the Vatican. I mean, forget the Vatican. It's in a bank in Switzerland. No, whatever they say, it's all deriding the riches of those rich people, while the poor people in South America and Vietnam who are Catholics donate their hard-earned money. Have you noticed this in yourself? When you are feeling the most generous, it's because God has given you the most. And if God's given you the most, you don't care that that guy also might have something. You want to be generous to others. Generosity is a function of understanding who God is, not that that church is going to steal from me. I'm not worried about it. Look, we get asked, not very often, but what do you do with all the offerings that you take? Because you take offerings all the time. Of course, it's not true. We have an offering box here. Once we might be able to buy a cake from it. But look, the whole point is not that I'm raking you guys over the coals, or anybody who gets our newsletter, or any Jewish person who comes to faith that we try to teach. If you really understand the gospel, what God gave you, you're going to be generous. You don't care what the other guy really does with your generosity. I mean, you do, because you don't want to be foolish, but you want to be generous. So whether it's to a poor person that you happen to see, or to what looks like a rich church, but you go there and that's your home, it's your community. If we sowed spiritual things in you, shouldn't we reap material things from you? It's the way it is.
I just want to say that if you want to be generous and you love God, believe in the gospel, but you can't give as generously as you want.
Well, it's not a quantity thing. No. Generosity is not about how much you give, it's how much you have left over.
Yeah, but even what you've left over, you're not as generous as you should be.
God sees your heart. I don't know anybody that feels that we give enough. Maybe you do. I don't. I never feel like I give enough. God's done so much for me, and I want to be generous. Just let that be your attitude, and then don't worry about the decimal points and the dollar signs. That's not the point. The point is your heart. Always the point. Verse 12, if others share the right over you, don't we more? Nevertheless, we don't use this right. We don't use this right, this trifold right. We don't use it. Well, how did Paul not use this right? Didn't he have a right to eat and drink from the offering box? How did he not use the right? What did he do for lunch? You mean this is the reason he's dealing with the subject? Well, he's dealing with the subject from last week of the liberty that he has and the freedoms that he has. So he's arguing to check yourself, be self-disciplined, O Corinthians, and he's using himself as an example. He's going to go on to other examples like athletes, but it's all for the same setting. I don't think they asked him about his money. But what did he live on? A tanner or a tent maker? That's right. So he did that as a side profession, and he preached. So he didn't want to be a burden to anybody. So he sewed tents, whatever those looked like in those days, and tanning. That's right. And he could always carry that with him when he traveled to Corinth or any other place, and then probably offered it to somebody to go sell in the marketplace. And then that would provide for him for the next month or week or whatever it was. He didn't want to be a burden, but he had the right to be a burden. That's what he's saying, because I'm just an ox. We endure, verse 12, all things, so that we will cause no hindrance to the gospel. Enduring all things is one of his themes throughout all his letters. He calls the believers not to a life of cushy, suburban pleasure, but to endure things for the sake of other people, to suffer on behalf of other people, to give, to be generous to the poor and to anyone who needs and asks. I think that's high praise that this rabbi who had tremendous capacity gave it up to serve these people. Now he appeals to the temple again that he's just referenced earlier in chapter 8. Don't you know, verse 13, that those who perform sacred service eat the food of the temple, and those who attend regularly to the altar get to eat from it. So, new, it's not hard. And who else did that? Not just Corinthian temples, the Jerusalem temple where the Kohanim and the Levites were working, and they ate. We studied those in the book of Leviticus. We saw many different offerings and sacrifices, and certain ones were eaten by the priest and his family. So again, he's giving a biblical answer to those who might be challenging him. Those who attend regularly have their share from the altar. So also the Lord, verse 14, directed those who proclaim the gospel to get their living from the gospel. Wow, where did the Lord do that?
Well, from the Levites, no?
Well, that's the allusion, but he's referencing the Lord Yeshua. When did Jesus direct those who were proclaiming the gospel to get their living from the gospel? Matthew chapter 10. Let's take a look. Verse 5. These 12 Yeshua sent out after instructing them. Don't go in the way of the Goyim, and don't enter any city of the Samaritans, verse 6, but rather go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And as you go, preach. Say the kingdom of heaven's at hand, heal the sick, raise the dead, do the work of ministry. That's what he's saying. Be out there and serve and preach the gospel. He's not hiding what he's telling them to do. Cleanse the lepers, cast out demons. Freely you received, now get out there and give. Don't, verse 9, acquire gold. Don't acquire silver. Don't acquire copper for your money belts. Don't earn money this way that you hoard it or store it, or a bag for your journey, or even 2 coats. You just need 1 coat. Don't worry about it. The worker is worthy of his wages or support, which he's going to quote as he references both the don't muzzle the ox and the laborer is worthy of his wages in his letter to Timothy, in a subsequent letter that Paul will write.
Did the disciples really heal the sick, cast out demons
Totally.
like Jesus?
Yeah, absolutely.
Did everything like Jesus did.
That's why they came back gobsmacked and excited as all get out. The kingdom had come. Verse 10. Don't take a bag for your journey. That bag is to collect stuff. Don't collect stuff. So you're thinking, well, wait a minute, how am I supposed to live? By faith. Verse 11, whatever city or village you enter, find out if somebody's worthy in it, stay at his house. So there's housing. As you enter the house, give it your greeting. Serve the people there. Bless the people. Give it a blessing of peace. Whoever receives you, they'll take care of you, basically. It's find out who's going to be there, and they'll take care of you. Don't be a hoarder. Be a generous person. You'll get your living from the gospel. These are called mendicants. It's an old Catholic term for a beggar, but a beggar who is serving. So kind of a mendicant preacher who's serving. He's not really begging, excuse me, do you have any lunch? But can I give you a blessing? And as a result of that, he receives lunch and dinner and housing. Verse 15 of 1 Corinthians 9, we go back to our text. I have used none of these things. I'm like an ox, but I'm not going to take the threshings off the ground. I'm like a farmer, but I'm not going to take the milk. I have every right to do that. I'm a soldier. I'm not going to use that. I'm not writing these things so that it'll be done so in my case. I'd rather die. But he's telling us and the Corinthians this so that we live in an honorable way, taking care of the preachers, taking care of the ministers, and serving. Just be generous. Don't even worry about it. Be generous. I think that's the key for me as I keep reading this text. Verse 16 and 17 and 18 is a funny little parenthesis of the apostle. If I preach the gospel, I don't have anything to boast about. I'm under compulsion. I've got a duty here. Woe is it to me if I don't preach the gospel. He's going to get, by the way, to what is the gospel, which would have been better, we think, in modern days if he'd have said that, what it is first. But in chapter 15, we'll get to that. If I do this, verse 17, voluntarily, I get a reward. But if it's against my will, I still have a job to do. That's the stewardship. I've still got to get out and do this. Why? Because God called him at that moment on the road to Damascus to be saved and go proclaim it to others. I met a guy, I was teaching on Hanukkah, and you know, the shamas lights the other candles. The servant candle lights the others. And I've often used this as an image that Yeshua is like the shamas, the servant candle, and he lights all of us, and we're lit to be lighting others. So I was preaching on this one day at a church, and some guy after the service shook my hand. I said, how you doing? And he said, I'm saved and saving. I thought, I get it. It's bad theology, but I understand. What he said was, God saved me, and I want to go out and help others get in on this very proposition. And I think that's exactly what the Apostle Paul would have said. I've got to do this. If I do it voluntarily, woohoo, I gain something. If I don't, I still have a duty to do. I'm saved and I'm saving. I'm lit and lighting. I've got to get out there and do the work. And you get to do the work in your world, wherever you are. When you get this, you'll be generous towards those who aren't with us. That makes sense. So what then, verse 18, is my reward? That when I preach the gospel, I can offer the gospel without charge, so as to not make full use of my right. And so then he says these odd things that sounds like he is a chameleon. What's a chameleon?
Someone who changes shape or size.
Color.
Yeah, lizard. It's a lizard that changes on his environment. He wants to fit in. So some people say that the Apostle Paul here is just a chameleon. He's not real. To the Jew, I became like a Jew. See, he wasn't really a Jew. He just became one. He was a crypto-Jew. He was a pretendo-Jew. The Apostle Paul, Rabbi Saul of Tarsus, was a pretend Jew? Hello? I don't think so. But listen to this language. I did that so that I can win Jews. See, it's all pretend. He kept kosher among the Jews, but outside he's having a pork chop with a big glass of milk. Isn't that what it says? Verse 21, to those who are without the law, I became as without law. Does that mean he went to the dirty picture shows? And does that mean he beat up on guys when they were laying in wait in the corner? He became like, no, because look what it says. Though not being, verse 21, without the law of God, but under the law of Christ, so that I might win those outside the law. So he's saying, I can act like an unbeliever, but within boundaries. I'm not really acting like an unbeliever. I'm going to hang out. With the golfers, I become a golfer. With the guys at the pub, I'm going to be a guy at the pub. In other words, I'm not going to sit in my room and say, I'm holier than thou, you publican. I'm going to hang out with people and be where they are, though restrained by the laws of God. That makes sense to me. So he constantly did it. It's the model who was Yeshua. Exactly. To the Jews, I became a Jew that I might win the Jews. To those under Torah, as under Torah. So I do all these things, verse 23, for the sake of the gospel. I become weak to the weak ones. I've become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. So you look at people not as they have to fit into your world, but you want to fit into their world. That's generosity. And that's his argument about not eating food dedicated to idols. Yes, you're free. Yes, you can do it. But don't do it if it's going to cause a brother to be scandalized or offended. Then he uses this image, I love it, verse 24 to the end, of the Olympic Games. And we are well aware of that, Sydney, not just since 2000. But we're very aware of sport, anywhere and everywhere we go. And his argument now is that we're all running in a race, but only one receives the prize. So discipline yourself. Prevent yourself from living a life of sloth and living a life of luxury, of self-pandering. But you work hard. Everyone who competes, verse 25 in the games, exercises self-control in all things. Not Ian Thorpe can't go out for Krispy Kremes every morning, right? He's got to exercise self-control. It tastes so good, Bob. I know. It's a great donut. But Ian, I don't want to see that little weight on your side. I don't hip hug. What do they call it?
Love handle.
Love handle. I don't want to see that on Thorpe, right? Because that's going to influence his swimming. Oh, it's just one. No, he exercises restraint for the sake of the bigger prize. And the prize is this, verse 25, it's not a perishable wreath like they gave them in the Olympic Games in those days. Not gold medals, not silver medals, but a Stephanos. Stephanos is the Greek word for a wreath, but now it is imperishable. Now it really is gold and silver and precious jewels, like we talked about in chapter 3. Therefore, I run, verse 26, in such a way as not without aim. I box in a way as not beating the air. Again, another image to physical fighting, boxing. But I discipline my body. I check it so that I'm not disqualified. King James says, so that I'm not cast away. Don't read that wrong. Doesn't mean you're going to lose your salvation. It just means, well, let me read it to you from Eugene Peterson's The Message. It's not a translation, but it's a great way to read it. You've all been to the stadium and seen the athletics race. Everyone runs, one wins. Run to win.